Hello, and welcome to California Death Row, where we're talking about it. There are currently 727 condemned inmates on California Death Row. Today, we're going to talk about the Trailside Killer, and he's also the oldest condemned inmate on California Death Row. His name is David Carpenter. He was 50 years old at the time of his first offense. He was convicted in San Diego County and Los Angeles County. He committed his first he didn't commit him in San Diego or Los Angeles. He actually committed him in two different counties, but because they had to change a venue due to the press and people being exposed to it, they changed venues. So you can put in a special request and have a change of venue, and that's what happened here. He was received on November 26, 1984. So, Stephen Haertle and Ellen Hansen, in March of 1981, they were students at University of California, Davis, also known as UC Davis. Stephen was a junior and Ellen was a sophomore. The last weekend of the month, they were camping at Henry Cowell Redwoods State Park in Santa Cruz Mountains. They spent Saturday night in the park, and then they visited Monterey on Sunday, March 29th. I'm sorry, I have the hiccups right now. That afternoon, they returned to the park and around 4 p.m. decided to go for a hike. Stephen and Ellen walked to an observation deck, then along the ridge trail towards the Cathedral Redwoods. About a mile from the deck, they met a man. Evidence showed that this would be David. David was walking in the opposite direction, and they passed without speaking. Stephen and Ellen continued to the Cathedral Redwoods, where they sat for a few minutes enjoying the view. They decided to retrace their steps and return to the campsite. While hiking back along the ridge trail, they encountered David again. David pulled back a revolver and pointed the weapon at Stephen and Ellen. Now, there were a few words that were exchanged before he pulled the revolver on them, and then being Stephen and Ellen, he said something along the lines, "Oh, we've met again," because he had previously just passed by them. So he pointed the revolver at Stephen and Ellen and ordered, "Do what I say." Stephen pulled his hands up until David told him to put them down. David told the two, "Do what I say, you won't get hurt." Stephen warned Ellen, "Be careful, Elle, he's got a gun." David gestured at Stephen and told him to go down the trail. Stephen stepped backwards and then heard Ellen say, "Don't listen to him, Steve. Don't listen to what he says." Stephen pleaded with David to let them go. David told them, "Now listen to me and do what I say." He approached the two and looked at Ellen and said, "I want to rape you." Ellen responded, "No, I'm not going to let you." Stephen advised her, "Ellen, stay away from him. He's got a gun." David ordered them to move towards the bushes off the side of the trail and gestured with his gun. They both stayed away from the gun. As the gun moved over to the edge of the trail, they went towards the edge of the trail. Stephen started to lose his footing, and then shots went off. Stephen felt like something hit his neck with a sledgehammer. He also felt something hit his right hand. The next thing Stephen remembered was waking up lying on the ground. Stephen observed Ellen lying face down on the ground, and her head was in a pool of blood. He picked up Ellen's head to see if she was alive. She wasn't. He saw David across the trail with his back to him. Stephen got up, bleeding from the neck, and fled towards the observation deck as fast as he could. Now, Leland and Kenneth Fritz were father and son, and they were also in the park that afternoon. Around 5 o'clock, they saw David on the observation deck and briefly conversed with him. David occasionally peered towards the ridge trail with binoculars. David then left and walked to the ridge trail. Two other campers, Fred and Maureen Morse, saw David get a drink of water at a fountain near the deck. A few minutes later, the Fritzes and the Morrises heard gunshots from the direction of the Ridge Trail. Leland and Kenneth Fritz began walking down the trail in the direction of the shots. They soon met the wounded Stephen fleeing towards them. Stephen told Leland and Kenneth Fritz what had happened. They assisted Stephen to the observation deck, left him with Maureen and Fred Morse, and then went to summon help. Maureen, a nursing student, began applying first aid. Fred went down the trail to seek Ellen. David told Fred someone had been shot along the trail and continued walking. While Stephen was receiving assistance, he saw David walk up the trail. He stood, pointed at David, and yelled at Maureen, "Lady, that's the man that shot me. Get out of here." David kept walking. Maureen testified that David was walking through the clearing like he didn't see us or hear him, being Stephen, yelling. Once David disappeared, Maureen walked down the path towards Fred, and Stephen fled to the campground, from which he was eventually taken to the hospital. Law enforcement officers soon arrived, but were unable to apprehend David. Leland Fritz and a young girl in the area saw David speed away in a red Fiat. Stephen's initial assessment that Ellen was dead proved correct. Ellen died of 2 gunshot wounds to the head and 1 to the right shoulder, fired from close range. Stephen had been shot in the back of the neck. That night he underwent surgery and the bullet was removed from behind his sternum. It had hit an artery and missed the heart by 2 inches. Now, if you're wondering what the sternum is that breastbone that you feel on your chest. That's the sternum. Stephen was in the hospital for 8 days, and at trial, he still suffered lingering effects from his injuries. Heather Scaggs and David Carpenter were co-workers at a trade school in Hayward. Heather lived in San Jose with her boyfriend. On May 2nd, 1981, she arranged to drive to Santa Cruz with David, where he hoped to purchase a car from a friend of his. Her own car was inoperable. No one saw her alive after that day. That night, some of Heather's friends spoke with David to try to find out what had happened to her. David confirmed that Heather and he had planned to go to Santa Cruz together, but claimed he overslept, had car trouble, and never saw her. A few days later, on May 8th, David told police the same thing. On May 24th, 1981, hikers found a nude, decomposed body in a mountainous, wooded terrain 136 yards off the roadway in the Big Basin State Park in Santa Cruz County, about 12 to 15 miles from the Henry Cowell State Park. Dental records proved it was Heather Scaggs. She had died of a single gunshot wound to the face from close range. The vaginal tract contained a high concentration of seminal fluid with a large number of sperm, some with intact tails, indicating they had been placed in the vagina around the time of death. A pathologist who performed the autopsy believed that the sperm was placed in the vagina within an hour of the gunshot wound. The condition of the sperm and body were consistent with the body being shot from above while lying on the ground after intercourse. Forensic analysis of the semen was inconclusive. On October 11, 1980, Cynthia Moreland and Richard Stowers were fatally shot in the head near a hiking trail in a heavily wooded area of Point Reyes National Seashore. Hikers heard gunshots in the area sometime around 1 to 2 p.m. that day. Cynthia and Richard were discovered on November 29, 1980, laying face down near each other. On October 13, 1980, Ann Alderson was fatally shot in the head from close range near a hiking trail on Mount Tamalpais, I'm not a hiker. I'm sorry if I completely misread or mispronounced that mountain. A caretaker of a nearby inn last saw her alive near 5:30 that evening. Her body was discovered 2 days later on October 15th. Anne was clothed, but her vagina contained sperm, indicating she had had sexual intercourse around the time she died. On November 28, 1980, Diana O'Connell and Shauna May were fatally shot in the head at Point Reyes National Seashore. Hikers heard gunshots in the area around 3:10 p.m. that day, followed by more shots about 10 minutes later. The next day, Diane's and Shauna's nude bodies were discovered face down, side by side, about 200 yards from the bodies of Cynthia and Richard. A pair of panties was in Diane's mouth and nose area, and a bloodstained second pair was by her arm. Physical evidence indicated Diane had also been strangled, probably while still alive, by something like a narrow piece of cord or wire. No sperm was found on her body. Shauna's vagina and rectum contained sperm, indicating she had had sexual intercourse around the time she died. A vague ligature mark was found on her left wrist. So the case that was in Los Angeles, the crimes took place in Santa Cruz County, but due to a change of venue, the case was tried in Los Angeles. David was found guilty of first-degree murder of Ellen and Heather, attempted murder of Stephen, attempted rape of Ellen because he said, "I want to rape you," and rape of Heather Scaggs. The jury found true of special circumstance allegations of multiple murder, killing of Heather and Ellen, rape murder as to both murders, and lying in wait as to Ellen Hansen's murder. As to the attempted murder, jury found David personally used a firearm and inflicted great bodily injury. A different jury returned a verdict of death following the penalty phase. Of the 5 other murders that were later discussed, the crimes took place in Marin County, and due to a change of venue, it was tried in San Diego. So that's how he has a Los Angeles conviction and a San Diego conviction. He was found guilty of first-degree murders of Cynthia, Richard, and Diane and Shauna. He was found guilty of rape of Anne and Shauna, and attempted rape of Diane. The jury found true a special circumstance of multiple murder and rape murder of Anne, Diane, and Shauna. So when it comes to multiple murder, they can use the previous conviction of the Los Angeles case of being convicted of those murders and that being a special circumstance in this case of these multiple murders, showing that he has killed before and he was convicted of it. So even though this Los Angeles, well, technically Santa Cruz murders happened after the murders that happened in Marin County, the case that was brought to Los Angeles and tried, he was found convicted of those murders before the Marin County murders. So they were able to use that against him. The jury found that David personally used a firearm at each crime. After the penalty phase, jury returned a verdict of death. The Superior Court imposed that sentence of death, and then later, the same court, the Superior Court, granted David's petition for writ of habeas corpus, which means produce the body, and vacated the judgment. The Supreme Court of California, on April 18, 1997, affirmed the judgment of David's Los Angeles sentence, and then on November 29, 1999, they reversed the judgment made by the Superior Court and reinstated the death judgment on his San Diego case. So then they affirmed the judgment in its entirety of the death sentence for David. So he's serving 2 death sentences, actually. So where is David Carpenter now? David Carpenter is 90 years old. He is the oldest condemned inmate on California death row. He resides in San Quentin State Prison, where he was received November 26, 1984, after receiving death for the Los Angeles case. And then July 19th, 1988, he received death in the San Diego case. So he's almost spent 34 years on death row. So that's where David Carpenter is now, the Trailside Killer, still on death row, 90 years old, still alive. So if you want to learn more about who's on California death row, just take a listen at our other podcasts. We upload Monday, Wednesday, and Saturday. Thank you for tuning in. You can give us a follow, a subscribe, a like. We'll take any. If you have any comments, just comment below. Yeah, our email is out there somewhere. So see you later.